Boldwood presents High Hopes at the Second Chances Sweet Shop, written by Hannah Lynn and read by Gloria Sanders. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Chapter 1. Holly Berry was sitting on an exceptionally comfy sofa. With its soft round cushions and high back, this wasn't some flat-packed, mass-produced run-of-the-mill sofa. This was designer. The type of sofa that you could curl up and sleep on all day and all night for a week and not even suffer the slightest crick in the neck. This was absolute luxury. Yet, despite all its softness and plump cushions, Holly was exceptionally uncomfortable. Summer was on the turn, and after a month of scorching days where no number of fans or air conditioning had been enough to lessen the stifling heat, this week had been substantially milder. They had even been treated to a little rain. But that didn't change the fact that Holly was currently dripping with sweat. Then again, it had nothing to do with the weather, she thought, as she cradled her swollen belly. So, tell me, would you like to continue what we were discussing last week, or are there any new issues that have arisen? The ball is in your court. The woman opposite peered over her glasses as she looked intently between Ben and Holly before finally settling her gaze on Ben. Holly glanced to her side, where Ben was sitting bolt upright, his shoulders and back rigid, looking almost as awkward as she felt. He cleared his throat a couple of times before turning to Holly. "I guess it's up to you," he said. "We should talk about whatever you want to talk about." It took all Holly's resolve not to bite. Instead, she gritted her teeth. She should have known that Ben would push the focus back on her. That was what he always did. Though, to be fair, that was probably what she would have done had the question been directed at her. Holly and Ben were 6 months into their sessions with couples counsellor Dr. Ellis. Deep down, Holly knew it had helped them both open up about their issues. But at times like this, she really wished she'd never suggested it at all. I suppose there have been no new issues," said Holly, trying to read the expression on the counsellor's face as she scribbled a few notes on her tablet screen. No new issues at all. It's been a good week, I think. Don't you, Ben?" "I think so," he added, nodding vigorously in agreement. "I think it's been a very good week." "Why is that?" Dr. Ellis asked, glancing up from her screen to look at Holly. "What's made this week particularly good?" From the way the woman was staring so pointedly at her, Holly knew she had no choice but to answer the question. And it wasn't that she didn't want to. It was just difficult to know what to say. Well, we've had dinner together 3 nights this week, or maybe 4. Was it 3 or 4 nights, Ben? She desperately wanted him to take the reins. "I think it was 4 nights, he said. "Right, 4 nights. And Ben is still walking me to work each morning?" she added hurriedly, thinking that might be something Dr. Ellis would award a gold star for. Not that she did things like that. Though maybe she should, Holly thought. Maybe people would sort out their relationship problems more quickly if a sticker chart was involved. Satisfied that she had answered the question well, Holly allowed herself to relax into the cushions, but her muscles had barely loosened when the counsellor hit them with another question. One she really should have seen coming, no matter how much she didn't want to answer it. "And the intimacy?" Dr. Ellis asked. "That's still an issue?" Only the slightest question mark inflected her speech as her gaze moved between the pair of them. At this point, Holly couldn't look up any more. She couldn't look at the counsellor, and she certainly couldn't look at Ben. So instead, she glanced down at the massive balloon that was now her stomach. At the beginning of her and Ben's relationship, intimacy hadn't been a problem at all. Unless the problem was how much of it there was. For those first 2 months, they couldn't keep their hands off one another, which got them into this situation. Polly was pregnant with Ben Thornbury's baby, and while on paper the pairing really wasn't too bad a match at all. Fun, caring sweet shop owner and hard-working, trustworthy bank manager. Seeing things on paper and living them in real life were very different. "We've been cuddling a lot," Holly said, desperately needing to break the silence swirling around them. "And kissing, too. I'd say there was definitely more kissing this week, wouldn't you, Ben?" She looked at him now, unable to hide the pleading in her voice and eyes. It was time he did some of the talking this session, although she felt a little guilty about throwing that particular question in his direction. The pregnancy had definitely not been planned. In fact, it had been so unplanned that only days before Holly had discovered she was carrying Ben's child, she had broken the whole relationship off, fearing that Ben was still in love with his ex. Upon finding out that he was about to become a father, Ben had become so overbearingly controlling that Holly threatened to cut him out of the baby's life entirely. But that hadn't lasted long. The truth was that since his tempestuous reaction to discovering Holly was pregnant, Ben had been trying to do everything in his power to make sure this pregnancy went as smoothly as possible. It was Ben who had read all the terrifying baby books that listed every possible disaster scenario, so that Holly didn't have to. He had gone through the list of suitable and unsuitable foods, preparing meal plans so that she didn't have to worry about that. He'd been there with foot massages, on late-night cravings runs, and all this while working all the extra hours the bank could throw at him. Several of the smaller local branches were closing, and while the Bourton branch currently remained, he had taken the leap into personal banking. It had its plus sides, more flexible hours that would help when the baby came, not to mention the extra money. But he was at the beck and call of the clients, meaning he had to travel here, there, and everywhere, sometimes with only a couple of days' notice. Simply put, he was doing everything he could to make her happy and more. "Well, kissing is definitely a good thing," Dr. Ellis said, breaking the silence, although Holly couldn't help but notice that Ben had stayed quiet on the matter. Now that she thought of it, there had been a couple of times in the week when she'd pulled away from him. When they'd been watching a film on the sofa, the kissing got a little too intense. But then what did he expect? She was 8 months pregnant. She could barely even maneuver herself to get into the car. Surely he understood that any antics in the bedroom were off the cards for a little while at least. Besides, he'd not put her in the best mood earlier in the evening when he had commented on how all the sugar she was eating could put the baby at risk, and had therefore cleared out all sugary foods from his cupboards, apparently overlooking the fact that Holly owned a sweet shop. "Ben, Holly's done a lot of the talking this session," Dr. Ellis said, finally giving Holly her deserved dues. "Why don't you tell me how you're feeling? Is there anything you feel Holly could do to help you feel more secure in this relationship?" The relief that Holly had felt at having the attention taken away from her immediately evaporated. These were the type of questions that caused her stomach to flip and her chest to tighten. Somehow, it was even worse when Ben answered them than when she did. "Ugh!" Ben let out a long sigh that blew like a heavy gust of wind between them. Even when it was done, he took another deep inhale before he actually said something. "I guess I still feel the same that I've felt since we started the sessions. That Holly's holding back from me." "And why do you think that is?" I don't know what more I can do." Dr. Ellis nodded a few more times, although rather than jotting anything down on her tablet, she was already straight back at Holly with the next question. So, what can you say to Ben about how he's feeling, Holly? The room was shrinking in on her as two sets of eyes bored into her. How many times had she answered this exact same question in this exact same room in front of these exact same people? She wanted to scream at them. 10, 20, 100? It certainly felt like that. So why was she still asking the same question? In the pit of her annoyance, guilt flickered within her. She knew exactly why she was being asked again. Because the truth was, she probably was holding back. She just didn't want to admit it. We had broken up, Holly said, unable to hide the exasperation in her voice. And some of the things he did and said made me, I don't know, wary, I guess. But you want to be with Ben now? Of course I want to be with Ben now. Because you love him? There had been a time when it had been so easy to say, when the words had been desperate to jump off her tongue well before she knew about the baby. They had said it to each other since. The night Ben wrote a letter explaining everything he had gone through in a previous relationship. He had professed his deepest, truest feelings to her. She had told him she loved him then, and in the weeks that followed. But for some reason it had got harder and harder with time, and those words were forming on her lips much less often, if at all, over these past few weeks. And it wasn't meant to be that way, was it? Surely it was meant to get easier to tell someone you loved them, not more difficult. So what did it mean? A little thought flickered in the back of her mind, but she pushed it down as far as she could. I am terrified of being hurt, she answered, the only truth she could give. I am terrified of what the future holds. Right now, all I can think about is how I will keep my business and my life together with the baby. That's all I have space for in my head. And you think loving Ben will take up more space? Dr. Ellis tipped her head to the side quizzically, eyeing Holly with increased curiosity. How do you think taking this last little leap of faith would change things? You're already in a relationship together, aren't you? A lump had formed in Holly's throat. A thick and obstructive lump that didn't want to let her speak. She attempted to clear her throat, blinking as she felt the prick of tears start to burn behind her eyes. She wasn't going to do this. She wouldn't cry here again. She swallowed and then opened her mouth, unsure what she was even going to say, when Ben took her hand and squeezed tightly. Don't worry, he said, his eyes solely on her. There's no rush with this. I'm not going anywhere. Holly smiled, squeezing his hand back with all the strength she could muster, though it still wasn't enough to stop that ache from spreading through her chest. Chapter 2. By the time they finished their counselling session, Holly felt like she had gone through a mental marathon. It was always this way, utterly exhausting and emotionally draining. The single hour on Dr. Ellis's comfy sofa left her feeling crappy and crabby. But she was the one who said they had to do this if they were going to give this relationship a real go. And she stood by that. There was no denying that she and Ben were talking much more about their feelings, past relationships, and what would happen when the baby came. She had learned more about him and the inner workings of his mind in the last few months of counselling than she had after years with her ex-boyfriend, Dan. But there were just a few sticking points. That was all. Right, I guess I should go do the food shop now, Holly said. This had become their routine in the last weeks. Since Stow-on-the-Wold was smack between Moreton-in-Marsh, where they had their counselling sessions, and Bourton-on-the-Water, where there was the biggest supermarket in the region, it made sense for Holly to get her weekly shop in straight after the sessions. "Why don't I come with you?" Ben said. "I'm sure I can spare another half an hour, and I don't like the idea of you carrying all those heavy bags alone." "The bags are no heavier than the ones at the shop," Holly insisted. "Besides, if you take time off now, you'll end up working late into the evening, and you don't want to do that. Honestly, it's fine. I'm sure if anything's too heavy, I can ask someone who works there to pick it up." "Okay, as long as you're sure." He leant over as if to kiss her, only to duck down, place both his hands on her belly, and place a kiss right on the top of her bump. "Be a good little thing for Mummy, okay? Don't cause her too much stress." When he stood up, he planted a light kiss on the corner of Holly's lips before turning and getting into the car. Holly followed him all the way down the Fossway to Stow, at which point Ben carried straight on to Bourton and Holly turned left into the supermarket. After parking, she pulled out the shopping list carefully curated by Ben for this, her third trimester of pregnancy. Obviously, alcohol was no longer allowed, but he had also insisted she limit her amount of oily fish, switch to decaf coffee and tea, and drink a maximum of 2 cups of herbal tea a day. Then there was the sugar situation. Given the sweet shop, there was very little Ben could do to erase sugar from her diet entirely, but he had suggested that she not bring home quite as many packets of fudge and coconut ice as she used to, by which he meant none. And he suggested she limit her baking to more savoury items so she wasn't too tempted. That was one of the reasons Holly preferred to do the food shop alone. If Ben was with her, it took 4 times longer as he Googled everything she picked up to check the macro, salt and additive content and decide whether it was a good idea for her and the baby. And she could sneak in a packet of crisps in the car on the way home too. Holly slung her handbag over her shoulder and ambled towards the shop entrance, practically salivating over the prospect of purchasing a Scotch egg or some other type of savoury contraband. She dug in her bag to find a coin when she reached the trolleys. One of her bugbears about shopping here was the fact that the trolleys were chained together only to be released with a £1 coin. Of course, she found it such a bugbear because she could never find a coin when she needed one. 2 minutes later, she was still digging about in the depths of her handbag. What was ridiculous was with the size of her bag, there simply had to be a £1 coin in there. There was everything else in there. A hairbrush, a water bottle, a small bottle of deodorant, a phone charger, at least 3 pens, 5 hair ties, 1,000 receipts, and goodness knows what else. She was digging about in the small side pockets, pulling out handfuls of coppers and a couple of rather squished fruit salad chews, when a voice spoke behind her. "I honestly do not understand why you don't just keep a coin in your bag for this. Is it that hard to remember? You come here every week." The corner of Holly's lips twitched with a smile, although she managed to suppress it and replace it with a glower as she turned around. Behind her, dressed in a salmon-pink shirt and wearing his most withering look, was Giles Cavity. "Well, isn't this a coincidence?" she said dryly. Chapter 3. "Mind out of the way," Giles said, placing his hands on either side of Holly's shoulders and shifting her half a foot to the left. "This is too painful to watch." Having manoeuvred Holly to the side of the trolley, he took a £1 from his pocket and slipped it into the trolley, releasing the chain and freeing it for her. "Right. What's on the shopping list today? How many things has he banned you from having this week?" Holly pulled the trolley out without speaking and dropped her handbag into the bottom. She turned it around to face the shop entrance, then threw a glance over her shoulder back at Giles. "Are you coming? I don't have all day. I need to get back to the shop." How could I refuse an offer like that? The truth was, Meeting Giles while doing her weekly food shop like this had been entirely coincidental. At least, the first couple of times they had done it. Despite being a snake that nearly cost Holly her sweet shop, she and Giles had reconnected back when Holly had first discovered she was pregnant, and his response had been overwhelmingly sweet when he sent her a care package full of antenatal vitamins and non-alcoholic wine. Since then, he had been there with the occasional text message, just checking how she was doing and if there was anything she needed. And these meetings, which, while initially accidental, had proved as regular as her and Ben's trip to Dr. Ellis. Not that Ben knew anything about it. Given his and Giles's general animosity towards one another, there was no chance Ben would take kindly to the news that the pair were strolling the aisles at Tesco together, even if it mainly did involve looking at the best offers on vegetable medleys. "You're very quiet today," Giles said as he picked up a basket, keeping his step in time with Holly's. "I take it the session with the shrink didn't go well?" "It's not a shrink," Holly told him. "It's a couples counsellor." "Aren't they the same thing?" Ignoring him, Holly pushed her trolley through the automatic doors, the chill of air conditioning hitting her like a blast. "I'm not in a bad mood," she said eventually. "I'm just thinking, that's all." "About the bank manager?" "Sort of," Holly admitted. "About a lot of things." She paused in front of the first aisle where they stacked the biggest offers and picked up a packet of washing powder. It probably wouldn't meet Ben's specifications for the baby clothes, but it would do for her things. Anything she could do to help save pennies at that moment was worth it. She dropped it into her trolley and was about to move on when she spotted a woman placing a large tray of tasters onto a small table. With what was probably her most decisive movement of the day, Holly left Giles where he was standing and marched over to the forest of cocktail stick flags, each planted into a sample of cheese. "Can I help myself?" Holly said to the lady. "Of course, dear. They're all rather good, but personally I think the Wensleydale is exceptional." Following the woman's advice, Holly picked out a flag with Wensleydale written on it and popped the cheese in her mouth. Oh, wow," Holly said from behind her hand as she chewed. "This is good." After testing each of the 4 cheeses on offer, Holly agreed that the Wensleydale was probably her favourite too, and was helping herself to another piece when Giles came up behind her, clearly determined to continue their previous conversation. "I don't know why you don't tell him," he said. "We do our supermarket shop at the same time. It's not like anything's going on." "I don't think it's physically possible, is it? With a bump that size, ugh." He mock shuddered, then threw her a sideways glance displaying his characteristic smirk. Holly couldn't help but smile, no matter how much she didn't want to. "You know you are a completely shallow arse, don't you?" "I hear some people find that utterly charming." Holly moved from the Wensleydale back to the Edam, and the pair fell into silence again, which Holly assumed would be broken when Giles risked another joke at her expense. But instead, he came out with something unexpectedly serious. "I think I should speak to Ben. Not about us. Whatever this is. I need to talk to him about the old people's home. He's on my list." Giles's list. At first, Holly had thought it was some kind of scary ploy to deviate from how truly evil he'd been to her. But the more she saw and spoke to him, the more she saw it was the truth. For the last 6 months, he had been trying to make amends for his past actions, trying to repair his reputation and standing in the village, and maybe gain a bit of forgiveness. And while Holly didn't think she'd ever be able to forgive him for what he had put her through, she knew there wasn't much more he could do to prove he had changed. "And I think you should tell him about these little rendezvous too. I'm starting to think you're ashamed of being seen with me." Holly scoffed as she reached for another cheese sample. Given that the Wensleydale was definitely better than the Edam and other 2 samples, she didn't want to finish on the wrong one. "You know I'm ashamed of being seen with you," she said, dropping 6 cocktail sticks in the waste tub at once. "I take it you like that one, dear?" said the lady with what appeared to be a rather tight smile. "Oh, it's delicious." "Then perhaps you want to leave some for other people to try?" Giles commented. Holly wasn't blind to the fact that almost all her non-verbal communication with Giles consisted of her glaring at him, but that didn't stop her from shooting him yet another glower. "Well, I'm glad I gave up an extra hour on the shoot for this riveting conversation," he countered back at her. This was how they generally spoke to each other, exchanging one insult and then another. It was a long way from the smart, sycophantic Giles who constantly sucked up to her as he tried to get information on the shop. And as it happened, Holly much preferred this version of him. "Well, if you feel my conversation is that dull, why don't you tell me something you'd like to talk about?" Holly said, her hand stretched back out for more cheese. "Okay, I will," Giles said, fixing her with a look. But it wasn't the usual look that he gave her, joking, friendly. Instead, this was an intense stare that she could feel boring all the way through her as he bit down slightly on his bottom lip. "Go on, then," Holly countered, popping yet more cheese into her mouth. "What do you want to talk about?" She turned back to the cheese platter, only to do a double take. The table that she had happily been helping herself from had mysteriously moved over by 2 or 3 feet, and the woman had positioned herself between Holly and the cheese. Swivelling her trolley around, Holly marched back over to the table, where she offered her best passive-aggressive smile before whipping her hand out for one more piece of cheese. She was still chewing on it when Giles spoke again. "Why don't we talk about why you should leave Ben and be with me instead?" An involuntary half-cough, half-gasp escaped from Holly's mouth, along with a small piece of Wensleydale cheese. Chapter 4. It felt like the cool air had been sucked out of the store and replaced by an infernal heat. Holly was used to feeling overheated. Being pregnant in the middle of summer did that. But this was something entirely different. This was not that sort of heat. These meetings with Giles had been nothing but platonic, or at least that was what she had told herself repeatedly. Yes, he had mentioned wanting to take her to meet his sister again a couple of times, and also mentioned wanting to sweep her off abroad. But in her mind, all those comments had been said in jest. But now she was looking at him, and there wasn't a hint of his trademark humour on his lips. Holly gripped the trolley in front of her, only half aware of the people trying to reach around her to get a punnet of raspberries. "My God, you are easy to wind up, Berry," Giles said, reaching across to pick up a punnet for himself and dropping them into his basket. "As if I could deal with you and all your drama. Geez, not to mention a baby. No, thank you, I think I'll stay well clear of that." "You really are an arse. You know that, don't you?" Holly said, the gasp of relief blowing from her lungs. The corkscrewing smile on his face showed the great pleasure that he had gained from Holly's discomfort, and for that split second, she wondered how she had ever considered Giles relationship material. There was quite possibly no man in the world who was less relationship material than he was. He was, however, a fun friend, and the time sped past as he talked about trips to Monaco and vintage sports cars that he was thinking of investing in. Still, they ambled around the shop contentedly, him filling his basket with frivolous things like artichoke hearts and smoked salmon, while Holly displayed all the exciting parts of her life with items like washing-up liquid and toilet rolls. They were just about to reach the till when Giles stopped her, grabbing her by the forearm. "Hold on a second. Don't move," he said. "Why?" "I said just stay still for a minute, will you?" Holly had thought it was simply another opportunity for Giles to wind her up when his hand reached up towards her hair. A twisting of nerves rippled through her as his fingers skimmed against the side of her cheek. Was he going to kiss her? Her mind screamed out to her, no, surely not, that would be ridiculous. He couldn't kiss her here in a supermarket. Or anywhere, for that matter. She was with Ben. He knew she was with Ben. Still, her throat was closing in, and a swarm of butterflies threatened to send her into early labour. She should say something, she thought to herself, when his hand swept outwards. "Your earring, it's come out," he said. "It has?" He plucked the offending item from where it had caught in her hair. As he withdrew his hand, there in the palm was a gold stud. It was far larger than Holly would have normally chosen to wear, and bolder too, with a bright green stone in the centre. But they were a gift from Ben, so she wore them most days. "Where is the back?" she said, as her hand went up to her ear to feel for the butterfly that held the earrings in place. Quickly realising it wasn't there, she brushed through her hair, looking on the ground to see if anything fell, but it didn't. "You must have lost it somewhere in the shop," Giles said. "Do you want me to go look? I don't know what the chances of finding it are, though. You're probably better off buying a new one." Holly continued to scour the ground by her feet for a moment longer, before releasing an annoyed sigh. "No, it's probably gone," she said, still pouting, despite being thankful she hadn't lost the earring. "Are you going to take this, or am I supposed to be standing here holding your earring like some kind of handmaid?" Giles's voice brought her back to the moment. "Sorry." Hurriedly, Holly plucked the earring from the palm of his hand, although at this point she found herself stuck. Her dress had no pockets, and her handbag was right at the bottom of the trolley beneath salad leaves, chicken fillets, and 3 dozen other packets, cans, and tins. "Here, give it back to me," Giles said, taking it back and dropping it into the top pocket of his shirt. "I guess I've just been promoted to your porter now." Holly smiled gratefully. "I think being a porter requires a little more work than you're used to," she said with a smirk. At the cashier, Giles loaded her bags back into the trolley, then paid for his own purchases. "I don't suppose I can tempt you with a coffee before you have to jet off, can I?" he asked casually when they reached the car park and he unloaded the contents of the trolley into the back of the car. Holly avoided his eyes as she replied. "I've got to get back to the shop," she said, "and I need to unpack all of this first." Giles's head bobbed up and down rapidly in a nod. "I get it. It's no problem. Well, I'll probably be doing my shopping around the same time next week. Who knows? Perhaps I'll bump into you again then." "Perhaps," Holly replied. "Although, I don't know." "Of course not." "This was nice. A nice coincidence," she added, the heat of earlier rapidly returning. At her words, Giles's eyes glinted. "It's probably my favourite coincidence of the week," he smirked. That was it. That was as much as Holly could cope with. She could feel the burning redness of her cheeks, the tightness in her throat travelling down and clamping around her throat. Leaving the trolley for Giles to deal with, she jumped into her car, switched on the engine, and dropped her hands into her lap. What the hell was she doing? Supermarket shopping with a man she was supposed to hate. It was the pregnancy hormones. It had to be, didn't it? Chapter 5. By the time Holly had put away the groceries and got back to the shop, it was nearly 4, and only an hour left until they would close for the day. Still, just one more was a hive of activity. While Caroline ran around the shop floor, hopping on and off the stepladder as she grabbed one jar of sweets, then another, Holly's dad, Arthur, was on the till, weighing up and bagging the sweets like an old hand. Over the last few months, Mr. Berry had managed to find the fine line between a friendly exchange with a customer and eliciting their entire life story. She had to give it to her dad. He really was an asset to the shop. That said, on quiet days he could still spend a full half-hour chatting away to the regular customers about an upcoming football match or the weather in certain areas of Europe if left unchecked. But on a day-to-day basis, he was a star. Since she had taken him on, he had worked every day she had asked him, and his flexibility had been an absolute godsend when it came to things like doctor's appointments, not to mention these weekly counselling sessions. "Do you need a hand?" Holly said, squeezing through the teeming customers to get to her dad. "What can I do to help?" "I don't think there's enough room back here for you, me and the bump," he said, indicating behind the counter. "Why don't you go upstairs and put the kettle on? Make us all a brew. It's been like this for over an hour. 6 coaches arrived after you left. 6. Holly watched on as men, women and children grabbed bags of lemon bonbons and sticks of rock. "Caroline?" Holly said, feeling like she should do something to help. "Anything I can do?" "Don't worry about us. We've got a rhythm. A cup of tea would be a lifesaver, though." Sensing that her presence was more of a hindrance than a help, Holly did as she was asked and trudged up the stairs, gripping the banister to keep her steady. Upstairs, as she filled the kettle, she wondered if there were other establishments where the boss was sent upstairs to make the tea, while the rest of the workers scurried about downstairs doing the actual work. In the end, she decided it didn't really matter either way. Hearing that the shop was still brimming with people, Holly waited a minute before she flicked on the kettle. After all, there was no point making them tea if they weren't going to be able to drink it while it was hot. Instead, she reached for her handbag and pulled out her phone. She had switched it off during her counselling session with Ben. As such, when she turned it on, it buzzed several times with messages, all of which were from her antenatal group, and she had no intention of reading them. Those women had way too much time on their hands. "Brill, you're here," said a voice coming up the stairs. Dre was the 4th and final member of the Just One More team, and despite being the youngest, technically speaking, she had been there the longest. She had been working for Maud, Holly's original employer, before Holly bought the shop, and was pretty much responsible for not letting it turn to ruin. Back then, she had worked far more hours than a teenager probably should have done. Maud hadn't even had the funds to pay her. But now she had enrolled at the local college and normally just worked at the weekends. "I wanted to remind you I'm not here this weekend," she said, leaning against the wall and dropping a large canvas bag onto the ground. Dre's fashion was as variable as the English weather, and over the 18 months that Holly had known her, she had gone through more metamorphoses than a caterpillar. That day, denim was the chosen form of attire. Her denim miniskirt and denim jacket were teamed with black boots and a denim headband that was wrapped around her dip-dyed pink hair. "I won't be back until Sunday night, so I can't do either day." "It's all on the calendar," Holly said, tapping the A3 planner on the wall behind her. In truth, Holly hadn't expected Dre to still be there working with them. But her exams the previous year had not gone as well as she had expected, or needed, and so rather than disappearing off to university, she had stayed close to home and was completing an arts foundation course. She seemed perfectly happy with the current situation, but from her comments about her father, Holly suspected Dre's parents were less than happy with the turn of events. With Dre's lectures and coursework, Holly's appointments and Caroline's childcare commitments, organisation was the key to keeping the place running. Organisation she was going to need even more of when the baby came. "Dad and I are both in and Caroline is on backup should we need anyone extra," You are definitely 100% free. So go, have fun, enjoy yourself. You still haven't told me what you've got planned." Generally, Dre displayed substantially fewer teenage characteristics than when Holly had first met her, yet the shrug she responded with reminded Holly of that goth-loving girl she had wrongly accused of shoplifting when they first met. "You know, this and that," she replied. "London stuff." "Sounds great," Holly laughed, before recalling something and cutting herself short. "You're not driving, are you?" she said. "No, why?" "I think Ben said something about protests going on. Road closures and tailbacks are expected this weekend, I think." "Oh, no," Dre said, shaking her head. "No, we're taking the train up. Should be fine." "Great. And don't worry about us. We'll be fine." Given that she had said what she came to say, Holly expected Dre to head back downstairs. But instead her eyes went to Holly's belly before lifting back up to meet her eyes. "Everything go okay with therapy and the bank manager today?" she asked. Holly pressed her lips together. "It's not therapy, it's couples counselling." "Is there even a difference?" Holly sighed. She should probably admit she didn't actually know, or at least look up the differences online. "Yes, everything is fine between Ben and me, thank you. We are fine. I am fine. Ben is fine." This time it was Dre who pursed her lips, twisting them as if she was sucking on a super sour. Dre and Holly had had plenty of heart-to-hearts over the last year or so. It was hard not to when they spent so much time together. It helped having a younger, more opinionated outlook sometimes. Besides, Caroline and Jamie were both incredibly close to Ben and were desperate for a fairy tale happy ending to come true, while Holly's parents were just so worried about everything that Holly didn't dare say anything remotely negative. Dre was always brutally honest about what she thought, no matter how much Holly didn't always want to hear it. "Fine," Dre responded with an eye roll. "That's a great word to describe the man you're about to have a baby with. Not brilliant, not incredible, fine." Holly knew what game she was playing at and she didn't want to bite. But the counselling session and the fact that she had a watermelon strapped to her abdomen made it harder not to snap. "Fine is good," she said. "When you get to my age, fine is absolutely acceptable. Lots of people don't get fine. Lots of people long for fine." "Your age?" Dre said, raising her eyebrows. "You know you only turned 30 a couple of months ago. And besides, I don't care about other people, I care about you, and fine is not good enough for you. You need someone who makes you feel how Eddie makes me feel." At the name of her boyfriend, Dre fluttered her eyelids. Though she'd never said it out loud, there was no doubt that Eddie was another reason Dre was less than devastated at not heading straight to university. While this hadn't been the first relationship Dre had told Holly about, it was the longest, and Dre was obviously smitten. Holly, however, remained quiet on the matter. Although Dre talked about him non-stop, Holly was yet to meet the elusive Eddie. But at 25, there was a 7-year age gap between him and Dre, and Holly was concerned that Dre was setting herself up for heartbreak. But then again, what person got through life without having their heart broken at least once? "Look, just make sure you are following your heart," Dre said. "You know it's only going to end badly if you don't." If Holly had got the strength to heave herself out of her seat, she would have hugged